I'm going to say a word.
Okay, I'll let you know to start with, this is clearly not a Jewish crowd if a 4 o'clock program is going to start at 4 o'clock. So, thank you.
Well, there's clearly a few Episcopalians sitting with us, and you can tell Episcopalians in a room because they're always the ones sitting in the back, generally speaking. So, and I'm going to say, because in the nature of this event, we're recognizing our connectedness in the human family together. So, Episcopalians, if you wouldn't mind joining in up here somewhere and spreading out in the crowd this way. And it may not all be in the back, but if you all will move up a little so that our presentation, I know what it is to present in this room when you're both talking to people that are way in the back and people that are in the front at the same time. It makes it a little easier if we're closer together. And I'm Andrew Canan. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the rector here at St. Paul's, which I jokingly say is the rector is the old English word for the priest that everyone else is in charge of here. We're so glad to have you this afternoon. I was really glad when Harley called in beginning of March for us to begin setting this up, though having to postpone from the 16th of April, we're glad that you all put this in your calendars to join us today. It is a privilege for us to have you in this space. I hope that you know afterwards there's a reception for everyone to get to spend a little bit of time together. That's in our parish hall, which if you'll follow the people that are sitting in the back of the room, they know how to get there, but it's right across our memorial garden into, you'll see the two open red doors. The doors are fairly well marked as parish hall, and follow the sounds of voices and follow the smell of food, and you'll be in the right spot. I'll hand it off to Harley to begin for us, but thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. I think I know almost everybody here. I'm Harley Karsweibman of the Rabbi Congregation of Beit Shalom, and we welcome you to what for me is the 7th annual Multifaith Holocaust program. I'm not sure how many were done in years before that, but it's a very important part of what we try to organize through the Jewish community, but with what we now call multi-faith. The difference between multi-faith and interfaith is that there are people who, when they hear the word interfaith, they think it means they have to blend with others, whereas multi-faith is clearly respecting each individual faith, which is actually what people who say interfaith mean when they say it, but it's just a vocabulary thing. It's 2023, and we are at a time where if you read, at least especially in the Jewish media, but even in the general media, anti-Semitism is on the rise again. After decades of dropping down, the last 5-10 years or so have been an increase that has gotten dramatic. At a practical level, what that means is this. 3 years ago in 2020, on an average day in America, there were 5 anti-Semitic incidents. Now, an incident doesn't mean somebody made a comment about George Soros or somebody said they supported QAnon, which are both acts of anti-Semitism. An incident requires either verbally a direct threat to somebody's safety, or physical action, vandalism against property, or unfortunately physical attacks on people, which is the most growing category. 5 a day is a lot to imagine, and that's reported in America as opposed to all those aren't reported. But the next year in 2021, we tracked 7 a day, and last year it was up to 10 per day. Every day, just the reported ones. There are more hate crimes committed against Jews in America, again based on reported crimes, than against all other ethnic groups combined. We're only 2% of the American population, 2 out of 100. And yet more than 50 out of 100 hate crimes are committed against Jews. And a hate crime, as you may know, has to be a crime itself. It's usually an assault that also is directed toward a group. But at the same time, there's a counter trend that doesn't get nearly enough publicity, which is part of what we are trying to remember today, because it also happened during the Holocaust. There is a growing number of individuals throughout America who are becoming more aware of the anti-Semitism and working so hard to fight them. And that's not just the 2% Jews, that is the majority of Americans. So while hate is growing, love is growing faster. Our government, as opposed to the government for the time we're going to be reading about, continually focuses lots of activity on anti-Semitism in America and anti-Semitism globally, and it's having an impact. And our students are learning about it in school more and more. Go back 2-3 years even, and I remember how many people I would hear, people of really good intentions and faith, who would have a litany of prejudice in America, and it would always be about race, and it generally would be about gender, and sometimes that included LGBT, or they might list off the various races or say religion. They would rarely include anti-Semitism. That wasn't true in the 60s. It started drifting off because of the good trend that anti-Semitism had dropped down. It's back. It needs our attention, but our attention in the perspective of knowing that those of us who want to fight against it have a lot of support out there. And if you can leave today feeling more empowered to be one of those people who was an upstander instead of a bystander, then today accomplished its purpose. Let's begin on the first page, please. Silence does not just bring to standstill words and noise. Silence is more than a temporary renunciation of speech. It is a door opening before prayer toward the very realms of the spirit and the heart. Silence is the beginning of a reckoning of the soul, the prelude to an account of the past and the consideration of the present. May our shared silence lead us to awareness of a time of total evil that degraded our most precious values, the very meaning of religious existence and of life itself. Our silence is to be a committed accounting for other silences, which accepted persecutions and were indifferent to debasement and crime. Let's take some moments for silent reflection. We have 7 people here who represent faith communities, represent our government, in fact, and are going to come up now. All of you who are lighting candles, if you'd please all come up together, and then we'll read one at a time. After each one reads, the congregation will respond. As you see on your program, we will remember.
We remember the lives of 6 million Jews and millions of others, Roma and Sinti, Gypsies, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, the handicapped, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political and religious dissidents in Europe. We will remember.
We remember that our souls are linked with those who were murdered so that we can contribute to the continuation of their unfulfilled dreams and hopes.
We remember to emulate the valiant spirit of those who rose up in the ghettos, the camps, and throughout Europe to defend the honor of humanity.
We remember to tell their story from generation to generation, to learn the details so that we can avoid the mistakes of the past.
We will remember those of righteous, gentle individual with courage to care the right risk of their life by saving the Jews and other innocent victim and Greater Liberty Alliance soldiers, those brave saved millions. We remember.
We pledge to work toward a day when all peoples will renounce our past horrors and join hands to proclaim that we are all one family. We will remember.
We show awe and honor by silence. Silence in the face of overwhelming proportions of the tragedy of the Holocaust.
Thank you all. We continue with a reading about the dangers of appeasement and the process of dehumanization with a famous reading from Pastor Martin Niemöller from the German Confessing Church. He spent 7 years imprisoned in a concentration camp, and what he wrote, we can all say, please, together. First, they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. We often hear a litany. The Holocaust was the systematic annihilation of 6 million Jews and millions of others. So who were those others? Most were not soldiers. They were gypsies and who prefer to be called Sinti and Roma. They were the handicapped, the mentally ill, gay men, communists, and Jehovah's Witnesses. They included Poles, political dissidents, and Soviet prisoners of war. Their stories are diverse. The death of anyone is as tragic as the death of any other. We do not compare tragedies. What we are doing and what we need to keep doing is researching their stories, telling their stories, learning from their stories. Their suffering and deaths cannot be excused. Their life stories can leave us legacies of faith, of resistance, and of goodness. Steve?
The Evian Conference. One of the most disgusting and outrageous moments of the Holocaust was the Evian Conference. In July 1938, President Roosevelt called an international conference at a scenic French resort, a place called Evian, to consider Jewish refugees. 32 countries sent representatives. By 1938, German attacks against Jews were well known. Yet Jews could still leave Germany, as well as Nazi-controlled Austria. However, the US, Britain, France, and the rest of Europe had set strict limits on Jewish immigration. so Jews had nowhere to go. The Evian Conference was supposed to find help for hundreds of thousands of Jews. The 32 countries, as well as a few dozen non-governmental organizations, held extensive discussions for 10 days. They decided nothing. Britain resisted pressure to open the gates to Palestine. No plans were even outlined to save Jews. Immigration limits remain tight. Excuse me. Less than a year later, in May 1939, a ship named the St. Louis left Europe carrying over 900 Jewish refugees. The Nazis were still allowing some German Jews to leave. The refugees had Cuban visas, but during the voyage, the Cubans withdrew permission and allowed only 29 Jews to find refuge. The St. Louis then went to Miami, which it sat in the harbor for days. It moved up the coast of America, moving from port to port, only to be turned away. After 35 days of sailing around, the ship had to return to Europe. While some of the 900 refugees found safety in Britain and elsewhere, many were returned to Germany, where they died in ghettos and death camps. The St. Louis.
Our keynote speaker, Lee Holder, is someone who got involved in Holocaust education sometime in the middle of the last century, it seems. Lee, when did you, do you remember when you started? 1990, okay, toward the end of it. Lee was a history teacher in Kinston and has just recently retired. And he put together a class in Holocaust history, which is quite astounding and amazing. He has been very actively involved with our statewide Holocaust Council, and he's going to tell you about something that our council shepherded through our legislature that is really kind of amazing and is part of that trend I mentioned in the beginning of a growing number of people interested in learning about anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and bullying and abuse. It's all the same dynamics, all the same way to counter it. And we are the 16th state, I think, is it, to mandate that the students in our middle schools and high schools learn about the Holocaust. My hope is that this is an ongoing trend that will keep growing as it has been for quite a while. So it's my honor to introduce Lee Holder.
I want to thank you for the invitation to come here and speak today. But for just a moment, I don't know if any of you are classroom teachers, but I want you for just a moment to imagine that you are a classroom teacher. You've got your lesson plans ready. It's a great day. You come to your school, you're waiting. You're a little bit surprised, though. There are no students in your classroom. Usually there's some there that are a little bit early, but you figure they're out somewhere on the playground or maybe they're in the student center. But then the tardy bell rings, the bell rings, and still no students. 5 minutes later, no students. So you go next door and ask your fellow teacher, do you have any students? And you open the door and there are no students there. And so you walk down, I would walk down the social studies hall, and there's absolutely no students in the social studies hall. So I go to the office and I ask, what's going on today? And they don't know either, but every classroom in my school, North Lenoir High School, almost 900 students report that there are no students there. So we call around Lenoir County, we ask the other schools, there are no students there. So naturally they start calling other counties. Every county is reporting the same thing. No students have shown up for class that day. From Murphy to Manteo, there are 1,513,234 students that are not at school that day. 1,513,234 K through 12 public school and public charter schools have not shown up for school. Why does that number resonate so much, especially in light of what we're doing here today? Almost 1.5 million children are not there. That is roughly the number of children that were murdered in the Holocaust. So when I think of those children, I think of those 1,513,234 empty deaths across the entire state of North Carolina. And that hits me very hard. One of the young people that were in the grasp of the Nazis during this time period, it was Gizella Gross. Gizella survived. If you ask her, well, how did you survive? What made you different than anyone else? She would not have an answer. She didn't know. One thing she didn't like is if someone said, well, was it because of luck? Guys, there is no luck in this. But Gizella did survive, and I know it might be a little hard for some of you to see, but here is Gizella. I'll get this straight. Here is Gizella. This is her mother, Hannah, and this is her little brother, Zeno. This is right before the war started. Let's fast forward to 1990. I'm a fairly new teacher. I hear about a Holocaust conference. I'm a social studies teacher in Little Washington. Naturally, I want to go. I'm very interested in World War II, know a little bit about the Holocaust. So I go to Little Washington to go to this program put on by the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. I get lost. I show up late. I looked in. Every seat was taken except for a couple in the very front. And being tall, I don't want to sit in the front and block anyone's view. So I almost turned around and left. But taking those steps down that walkway and sitting in the front row that day changed my entire life. It changed it professionally. It changed it personally. I sat down and little did I know this woman would walk out. This is Gizella Abramson in around 1990. This is the Gizella I knew. She was right in front of me and she told her story, and I will never be able to explain it to anyone, but when I looked in her eyes, I could see exactly what she was talking about. I didn't live what she went through, but I could visualize it by looking in her eyes. She's about 5 feet tall, full of energy. She told us her story, and I'll relate some of that to you in a few minutes, but it literally changed my life. And at the end, I think it was 2002, Elie Wiesel said, whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. Gizella put it more succinctly at the end. I'll never forget this. She just looked all of us in the eyes and then said, "Tag, you're it." Those were the words she left us with, "Tag, you're it." We knew, however, what she was talking about. It was our turn to now go tell her story and tell the story of those 11 million people, those 6 million Jews, those 1.5 million children. And I took it to heart. The next day I called her and said, "Could I bring my students to visit you?" And she said, "Well, give me a few days so I can clean up the house a little." And I was like, no, we'll find somewhere to meet. We're not going to come invade your house. But that was the sort of person Gizella was. She was born on August 22nd, 1926. Her mother's name was Hannah. Her father's name was Marcel, and her brother's name was Zenon. She lived in a farm with her maternal grandmother. Her maternal grandmother made sure she learned German, so she was fluent in Polish. She was fluent in German. She later learned Russian. She later learned Ukrainian, and she later learned to speak the Czech language. So she was fluent in 5 different languages, which, as you will see, saved her life. Now, her father, through an inheritance, had a small 1-bedroom apartment in a place called Preshmiel. Now, when World War II started on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded from the west and the Soviets invaded from the east. Gizella lived in eastern Poland, so her area was occupied by the Russians. They eventually took her farm, and her father, her mother, her brother, and her grandmother went to live in this one-room apartment in Pressmill. Now, eventually, what happened in May of 1941, her family decided to send her to spend the summer with her uncle, aunt, and 2 cousins in a place called Lutsk. And why that became so important, within 1 month, Operation Barbarossa started, and the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and she was separated from her family, and she fell under the control of the Germans. She never saw her family again. They were all murdered in the Holocaust. Now she's with her uncle, her aunt, and her 2 cousins in Pressmill, and the uncle decides, he was a very prosperous physician, he decides that eventually they're going to probably need to find a place to hide. But in the meantime, there are 4 things I want you to remember that she learned while she was in Pressmill. As soon as the Germans came in, they adopted all of the anti-Semitic laws. Gizella had to wear, as all other Jews did, she would always describe in detail how perfect the Star of David had to be, how perfectly sewn, how all the stitches had to be correct, and she wore it over her heart. And I didn't know at the time, but they also had to wear one on their back right shoulder. Gizella always said that I could see my enemies in front of me, and I could deal with that as best I can, but the enemies behind me, I don't see coming. So that star on her back, I don't know if I'm right on this, but after 20 years of taking students to visit Gizella and being with her at conferences and talking with her, I could tell, at least I thought I did, when her mind intensely went back to this time period. She would start touching that side of her back. Whenever she got quiet and contemplative, she touched that side of her back. So that's one thing I really took away from this time when she described it in Pressmill. Also, one day, her and her uncle were out, and her uncle was a prosperous physician, and some Germans were just shooting people. A couple German soldiers were just target practice. And a man not too far from Gizella and her uncle got shot in the back, and he fell down bleeding. Gizella's uncle grabbed her. He wanted to run help, but he knew if he did, they would probably be both killed also. The 2 German soldiers came over, and one was making fun of the other who had fired the shot. He was like, "You idiot, you can't even aim straight. You missed the star. You didn't even hit the star." And Gizella realized that their humanity had been taken away from them. They weren't people, they weren't human beings, they were stars. That's all they were to these Nazis. They were stars. And then the 2 Germans left the poor man dying. Gizella's uncle tried to save him but wasn't able to. So that was another lesson Gizella learned. Also, the phrase, I'm sure we all have, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." Gizella got real angry with that phrase, and she told my students about it every time we visit. She begged them, do not believe that slogan. Later, Gizella would be tortured. She would be beaten almost daily in Majdanek, but she forgot those. That pain went away from her. But Gizella told my students, never, ever have I forgotten a single time someone called me a dirty Jew or threw an anti-Semitic mark at me. I remember those times. The pain of the beatings went away. The pains of being called names never did. So I always took that to heart, and that's one thing I always tried to impress on my students. And the last thing, in European streets, there are little gutters on each side of the street for the waste and other materials to flow. Jews were forced to walk in those gutters. They were not allowed to walk on the sidewalks like everyone else. So they would walk in the gutters. And Gizella always gave my students and other students, she spoke for 20 years constantly everywhere. Military bases, schools, churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, you name it. If she was asked, she was there. She always left people with the same blessing. May you always walk on the sidewalk. And that speaks volumes, because to her, walking in that gutter every day was a symbol of everything that had been done to her. Okay, Gizella's uncle, Janik, he arranged for them to have secret IDs made. I'm hoping I have these in the right order. I don't. I meant to show you this one early. This is Gizella. She's 13 and a half years old. This is in May of 1941, right before the Soviet Union invaded. So that's what Gizella looked like, 13 and a half years old. This is Gizella's fake ID. Her uncle had it made. They used the papers of a former maid. Gizella's uncle was fairly wealthy. He was a physician. And they used those old papers from the maid, had this photograph, and on this, Gizella was a Catholic. Gizella had to learn to be a Catholic. That's what she was going to be when she went into hiding. Same thing for the other cousins and the uncle and the aunt. So this is Gizella's fake ID. She later used it to get into an American school high school in 1948 as a younger person. She was 20, 21, but she disguised herself as a 17-year-old so she could get an education. Okay, eventually they escape Luchk. They are going to the farm where they're supposed to be hidden. The farmer got nervous. He decided, I'll take the aunt, I'll take their two children, I'm not going to take the uncle. He made him go somewhere else because it made him nervous, and I'm not going to hide Gizella. I'm not going to hide this 13 and a half year old girl. For whatever reason, I don't know. So the uncle worked out a deal where Gizella would work on the farm as hired help, and she would pretend just to be a Polish girl who was orphaned. And that worked for a few months, but then the Gestapo came in and they searched the farm. Nothing was done with the search, but the farmer got really nervous and he made Gizelle leave. So Gizelle leaves and she's out in the forest trying to figure out what to do. She runs into a Russian resistance group. They take her in. She joins the Russian resistance. She has to prove herself every day. She's worried they'll kick her out. But they soon realize how intelligent this now 14, 15-year-old girl is and how many languages they speak, so they turn her into a spy. They train her. This is Gizella's fake ID. Gizella becomes Veronica. All the spy stuff you see on TV, they did that with Gizella. They would wake her up in the middle of the night. They would ask her who she is when she was still groggy. Every time for 3 weeks during this training, she gave a wrong answer. They slapped her really hard and said, "Who are you?" Until eventually Gizella became Veronica. They decided to send her to a farm, and this is how Gizella's spy career got started. She went to the farm area. A German officer visited the farm a lot with his entourage. Gizella's job was to listen to everything you could hear, don't let them know you speak German, steal scraps of paper, pick up garbage, draw down any insignia you see of officers, and then you report back to us. Gizella went to the marketplace of the town. Her code word is, "I want to buy the biggest gourds you have." And then the handler came back with, "Come back tomorrow, we'll have a better selection." And that's how she met her handler, and that's how she became a spy. She was so good at it, they sent her for more training and actually sent her to Lvov, I think that's the pronunciation, Lvov, which was a larger city, and she met her handler there, same deal, she wore a bonnet. Someone comes up to her, "It's sunny, you don't need a bonnet." She says, "I love my bonnet." So the handler and Gizella meet, and she gets her new assignment. This 15-year-old girl, almost 16, is assigned to go work in Gestapo headquarters. She became a custodian in the belly of the beast. She basically had the same assignment. Don't let them know you speak German. Report whatever you find. But then they come back. There is an ammo dump behind this Gestapo headquarters. We want you to map it out, find hidden things in their security system we might exploit, which she does. She makes wax impressions of keys. She's stealing trash. She's doing everything she can. One night as she's sleeping, she hears a loud explosion. It turns out that the ammo dump was blown up. She hoped for the rest of her life she had something to do with that. Her handler comes to her, and he's panicking, and Gizella's trying to calm him down. My cover's not blown, but he insists they try to flee. When they flee, they get captured by the Nazis, and she gets taken to Gestapo headquarters. The handler is murdered after interrogation. He doesn't give any information. Gizella is beaten and beaten and beaten. Her jaw is broken. Her nose is broken. Her left, I think it was her left leg and left hip, are so permanently damaged. They pour corrosive materials over her body. They pour it on her head. She just mercilessly treated. And then within about 4 days, when she hasn't given any information, they just dump her back in the ghetto. She's slightly nursed back to health by some of the people. She was just literally dumped on the street. But within a few days, a transport arrives and takes the residents of the ghetto to Majdanek, which is a concentration camp, transit camp, death camp, in which about 100,000 people are murdered, and many in the gas chambers, many people were just beaten to death or starved to death. So Gizella's there. Gizella, the only thing, well, two things real quick. When she was convinced that when she arrived and they did the selection, when she was being tortured by the Gestapo, they branded her left arm with the SS lightning bolts to show that they had interrogated her. She is convinced that that's what saved her life. She believed she was headed to the gas chambers at Majdanek. Someone noticed those lightning bolts, figured she might be of importance, and they allowed her to survive. The Germans at Majdanek eventually learned of her language skills, and even though she still has to go through all the other horrors everyone else does, she is going to be used as a translator for German prisoners. Russian prisoners, trying to go too fast. And what would happen is they would bring the prisoner in. Gizella would be sitting here, the prisoner there, and she would go through hours of interrogation prompted by the German officers. Whenever the Russian prisoner said something wrong, they would beat him with a whip. They had a man literally sitting next to him with a whip. But what really just is incredible to me, they had another guard standing by Gizella with a whip, and whenever they thought she wasn't being truthful, they beat her with a whip. So she was even being beaten doing what the Germans were asking her to do. One day at Majdanek, let me fast forward for a second. We were at Gizella's temple once with my students, and Gizella always said, my life is like an onion, that whenever I speak, it's like peeling back layers of memories. And it was a brutal day. Everyone could tell how hard it was on Gizella. It was very emotional. There were a lot of tears that day. The students were emotional. It was just a brutal day. And at the end, one of my students, just so vivid in my memory, one of my students named Aaron Crawford asked her, Miss Abramson, how do you do this every day? It is so obvious that it is painful. How do you do it? And she got really quiet. And to me, it seemed like it was a minute or two. And she bowed her head and she started touching her back. So I knew she was back there. And she just lifted her head and sort of softly said, I do this because of Anya. And then she was quiet. And then she said, this is all for Anya. So naturally, I'd never heard of Anya. Our next question was, well, who was Anya? And long story short, at Majdanek, the transport came in one day, and this girl with red hair, uncharacteristic red hair, bright red hair, Gizella said, they hadn't been shaved yet, and she had freckles all over her face, not the stereotype that you imagine. But this young girl immediately, when she could, just went in a frenzy from person to person to person and said, my name is Anya. My father's name is Boris. My mother's name is Kalina. For days, that's all she would do. My name is Anya, my father's name is Boris, my mother's name is Kalina. I'm Anya, my dad's Boris, my mother is Kalina, just in a frenzy. And everyone assumed that the poor child had just gone mad with everything that had happened to her. Gizella doesn't know the exact time frame, but she thinks about a week later she saw Anya. Her head had been shaven. She was in a line where Gizella knew she would never come back from. But Anya was quiet. Gizella said it was almost like she was at peace with the world. She wasn't telling anyone her name was Anya, her father was Boris, her mother was Kalina. She was content. And Gizella just couldn't figure out what had happened. The girl was going to a place that she probably knew she wouldn't come back from. A little while after that, Gizella was in her bunk, and the description of the way they had to sleep was horrific in and of itself. But Gizella just realized that this little girl named Anya, had everything taken away from her. Her whole life was turned upside down and destroyed. But the one thing the Nazis could not take from her was herself. They could not take away the fact that she was Anya, that her father's name was Boris, and her mother's name was Kalina. She had that. And just think of it, we're sitting here in Greenville, North Carolina in 2023, and now all of you know about Anya. Anya wins. Anya's being remembered. And my students were so touched by that without telling me. They had this plaque made, and I had this in my classroom for the next 20 years. It says, Anya, daughter of Boris and Kalina, who simply wanted to be remembered. Every single student, whether they were in a Holocaust class or not, in my classroom knew who Anya was. And since I've retired, I've opened up a Holocaust and Civil Rights Resource Center in Kinston. This is right there. As soon as you walk in, you see it. So anyone that comes into that space knows who Anya is. And that's something that we've done for not only Gizella. The center is named the Gizella Abramson Resource Center for Holocaust, it's a mouthful, Holocaust and Civil Rights Resources. But she's remembered and Anya is remembered. Okay, Gizella eventually is selected to be shot to death. The Russian army is moving in. Gizella is crowded into a group. They've already dug a shallow grave. Gizella, something just told her, she said, let me get to the back of this group. I don't want to be in the very back, but I'm going to move to the back. As soon as the Nazis opened fire, she quickly jumped in the hole, and bodies were falling in, being pushed in. The Nazis at the end even went through and were firing into the pit. Somehow Gizella wasn't hit. They threw a light covering of dirt, and then the Nazis got out, and the guards got out, because the Russian army was right there. The Russians come in. By that time, Gizella had dug herself up through the pit and was halfway in and halfway out, and the Russians found her. Gizella estimates she weighed about 60 pounds. They nurse her back to health. They find out about her language skills. They find out about her previous life as a Russian spy, so they bring her in. Gizella was incredibly bright. Without going into a lot of detail, one of the first things she said, since I'm so helpful to you, let me have a uniform to wear. She wanted a Russian uniform so she could be distinguished from the other women. She knew what was happening to all those women in those sites wherever the soldiers went. She knew what was happening, and she didn't want to have that same fate happen to her. Eventually, she was used to interrogate Germans. She kept hearing how Germans would rather surrender to the Americans than the Russians. She figured maybe if I want a life after all this, I need to sneak to the American lines. She goes through the American and the Russian army haven't met up yet, so there's this little area in between called no man's land. She makes it through that, makes it to the American lines, and collapses. She faints. She's out cold. Next thing she knows, she wakes up. First time she realizes when she wakes up, this is the first time in probably 3 years she's been clean. First time in 4 years, she wakes up and she distinctly, I wish I could describe it like she did. The sheets were white, they were clean, and they were crisp. She had not slept in a bed in almost 4 years. But then she immediately grew terrified again. She heard boots marching towards her, and she knows that boots mean trouble. And she sort of looks out of peeking her eye open, and there are these bright black boots, highly polished, laces all the way up, tightly tied, and slowly looks up, but the uniform looks a little different. She looks up a little further, and she sees black hands. Looks up a little further, she sees a black face. Gizella had never seen anyone of African descent in her life. This orderly was an African-American soldier, and she had never seen that before, and he could tell. He knew this girl was in distress, and Gizella said, I could see the compassion in his eyes. He picked her up. She weighed 80 pounds. Remember, this is an African-American orderly that endured the segregation of the United States and all that went with that. He bent down, picked her up in his arms, carried her to the window, and while he's holding her with his chin, points to the American flag and says, America, America, you're safe, you're free. For the rest of her life, Gizella said the most beautiful thing I ever saw was that 48-starred American flag. She's later asked by the United States to become a spy. They want her to go, the Office of Strategic Services asked her to go back to Russia and be a spy. She politely says, no, thank you. I love America now, but she just declines to do that. Long story short, while she's in the DP camp, she hears a lot of GIs talking about Brooklyn. Brooklyn's the greatest place in the world. She remembers she has an aunt in Brooklyn. They start contacting her. Aunt Regina sponsors her. She later finds out that her aunt and her two cousins also survived the war, and they've been writing Regina. And Regina, for various reasons, is able to sponsor Gizella, the aunt, and one of the girl cousin. She can't sponsor the boy cousin whose name was Emile, but they have another relative in Canada who does. So they all come to the United States. Gizella says that was the second greatest day of my life when I came to America. She said her greatest accomplishment in her entire existence is when she became an American citizen. She always classified that as her second birthday. She used that earlier photo I showed you to get into high school. She graduated in 1948, then was accepted to Sarah Lawrence College. And I just today, I wish I had looked through them, found 5 1949, 1950 Sarah Lawrence newspapers that talked about Gizella, which I can't wait to get back and read those. But one of her classmates was a little bit successful in journalism. Her name was Barbara Walters. So she was one of Gizella's classmates. Gizella eventually met her soon-to-be husband, Paul. They got married. They had 2 children, Michael and Holly. Michael is the president of the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. They moved to Raleigh, and for the next 20 years, Gizella speaks to all sorts of groups, and she loved this country. She worked hard to make this country the place it should be, and I wanted to share a little bit about her with you today, so I appreciate you letting me take the time to do that. Also, in November of 2021, they named the new mandated Holocaust Education Act after her. It's the Gizella Abramson Holocaust Education Act. This state, unlike a lot of others, actually attached money to it. Excuse me. We've got 6 curriculum team writers that have been writing curriculum for it. I'm very proud to say that I'm one of those 6, so right over in Lenoir County. But even better, Lauren Piner, who teaches in Pitt County, is one of the 6. Right now, our work is being reviewed by 52 teachers, 2 of which are from Pitt County. There are 115 school systems, and 2 from Pitt County are on this 52-person team. We are slated to roll out the legislation in grades 6 through 12 in August and September, and it's going to be English and social studies classes. And also, we are working on the elective now that will be rolled out next year, so that every school that wants one. Before this bill, I don't think it would happen that often, but it was possible. You could go through your entire 13 years of school and never hearing about the Holocaust at all. It wasn't anywhere. Now, naturally, teachers probably brought it up, but they didn't have to. And I think that's it. But I appreciate the time, guys. I really do.
Lee, thank you. That was absolutely amazing. I grew up in West Los Angeles, where my grammar school was so Jewish that we had grades K through 7, maybe 4 or 5, maybe over 100 students per grade. And on the Jewish holidays, the school had to stay open because it was Los Angeles public schools. They were able to fit all of the non-Jewish students and all of the non-Jewish teachers into one classroom. Okay. So that's my neighborhood, and my junior high was kind of like that. My high school is like 80% Jewish, 20% African American, and in my 13 years, Lee, we had one paragraph about the Holocaust, even in that setting in Los Angeles. So we have a long way to. It's amazing how far we've gone in teaching. And I'm glad for the couple of students who are here that you've had a chance in your schools. Kaylee, did you learn a little bit in school? You read a little about the Holocaust along the way, and you were telling me before that you're actually studying that right now, and that's really quite wonderful. We have a couple more stories and then some closing readings to finish our program, and then we'll go off for the reception. If you're thinking about not going to the reception at all, I do want to tell you, I'm honored and amazed. There's a challah, that's the bread that's up there. That's also down there, and they made knishes. Okay, so for those of you who understand what that is, it's an amazing. They consider it a Jewish dish. I'm sure the other Eastern Europeans have it too. It's really remarkable. But first, let's hear a little bit about the revolt in Warsaw that Ferris, our district attorney, is going to come up and read for us. And then Kaylee's going to read for us about a particular person who played an amazing role in that revolt. Her name is Irina Sendler. So.
The Warsaw Revolt. Warsaw was one of the largest ghettos with over 500,000 Jews crammed into a small area. In July 1942, the Nazis began transporting those Jews to death camps, such as nearby Treblinka. Within 2 months, less than 60,000 Jews remained alive in Warsaw. A Jewish resistance was organized. Despite the lack of weapons, food, or medicine, small Jewish combat groups drove the Nazi soldiers out of the ghetto again and again. Not until 7 months later, in April 1943, did the Nazis launch a final attack on the ghetto. With tanks and a massive force, the Nazis invaded. For 28 days, Jews fought the Nazis, house by house and building by building. The Nazi commander reported that all the remaining Jews were killed or sent to death camps. In fact, about 100 resistance fighters escaped to tell their story. Jewish resistance occurred in every ghetto and in every camp. Warsaw was just one of the rare settings in which the resistance was not crushed immediately.
Irina Sendler, a Polish Catholic social worker, helped lead a smuggling operation that rescued thousands of children from Warsaw's Jewish ghetto. After the German invasion of Poland in 1939, an estimated 400,000 Jews were forced into the Warsaw Ghetto. The size of 16 city blocks, they faced disease, execution, and deportation to concentration camps. Mrs. Sendler, who aided Jews when the war began, became an early activist in the clandestine group Zagota. This underground movement, whose members faced execution if caught, formed in 1942. After the deportation of 280,000 of Warsaw's Jews to the Treblinka death camp, Mrs. Sendler used her senior position with the city's welfare department to win access to and from the ghetto. She set up a network of 25 associates to organize escapes and falsify documents. Under the codename Jolanta, she became one of Zageto's most successful workers. She eventually took Cardiff Zageto's children's division and helped spirit the children out of the ghetto in ambulances by hiding them under blankets and burlap sacks and toolboxes, and sometimes in coffins. To distract German guards, she kept a barking dog on the front of the seat of her ambulance to drown out the cries of young children who feared separation from their parents. On October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo arrested her and took her to Pauiak prison, where subversives were tortured and killed. Over 3 months, her detainers used clubs and other devices to fracture her legs and feet. She did not inform on Zagota leaders and was sentenced to death by firing squad. But a bribed guard helped her escape and marked her as having been executed. Miss Sundler remained incognito for the rest of the war. She could not even risk attending her mother's funeral and continued to help Zagota. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, recognized Miss Sundler in 1965 as righteous among the nations, the designation for Gentiles who aided Jews during the war. After World War II, Miss Sundler lived in a relative obscurity and struggled financially under the communist regime while remaining in social work. She died in 2008 at the age of 98.
Thank you. The programs are for you to take home, please. And we're going to skip over the two poems so we can finish close to on time. When you flip to where it says, "Let Us Say Kaddish" by Elie Wiesel, and we're going to continue from there. Like, if you would, to read this responsively, I'll read 2 lines, you read 2 lines, and we'll continue that way. Let us say Kaddish not only for the dead, but also for the living who have forgotten the dead. And above all, let it be an act of remembrance, for that is what the victims wanted, to be remembered, at least to be remembered. They are now being defamed or forgotten, which is like killing them a second time. So let us say Kaddish together and not allow others to betray them posthumously. Please rise. And if you know the words, please join. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ba'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute, v'chayechon v'yomechon, v'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'arala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shemei Rabbah mevarach, la'alam ula'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, Yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei dekudashah b'rechu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran ba'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shalom rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, v'ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Please be seated. So we continue about Hannah Senesh. Born in Budapest, Hungary, Hannah Senesh became a Zionist, immigrated to Palestine in 1939 at the age of 18. In 1943, she joined the clandestine military operation by the Palmach, the Jewish army, as a paratrooper. In March of 44, she was dropped into Yugoslavia to support anti-Nazi forces in Hungary, her home country, where the largest number of Jews left in Europe lived, threatened with death, with deportation to Auschwitz by the Nazis. Senesh was captured in June and sent to a prison in Budapest, where she was tortured. Since Senesh would not talk, Hungarian authorities arrested her mother. Both women remained silent. Given the chance to beg for a pardon in November 1944, Senesh chose death by firing squad. Her mother was instrumental in keeping her daughter's memory alive. She published Hannah's diary, poetry, and plays, including the poem Eli Eli, which was later set to music, which we now hear sung by Eloise Clark. Eloise?
Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, ahol ve'ayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tefilat adam, ahol ve'ayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tefilat adam.
Thank you. We have a couple of concluding readings. The first one is going to be by Reverend Andrew Shue, a poem written by a friend of mine. He actually wrote this for one of these multi-faith Holocaust programs we did back in the 1990s in Hot Springs. So if you would join Andrew responsively, paragraph by paragraph, please.
So again, by paragraph to paragraph, I'll begin with the first paragraph if you'll read the second paragraph that transitions to that second page there. Can we stand as we say this together, please? I'd rather pretend it never happened. I'd rather believe that the sky was never blackened by the smoke of human death, that children and mothers and innocent men were never victims of such a magnitude of hate. I'd rather pretend it never happened and believe that it could never happen again. Yet I know that as long as I look upon even one other person with seeds of hate and fail to see him as my brother, or her as my sister, or them as my family, then my own precious soul is fertile ground for these seeds to sprout yet another Holocaust.
Thank you. Please be seated. I guess it would be more fitting if this was sliced up and dried as wafers, but so this is a challah, the traditional bread that Jews eat usually on the Sabbath. We have two of them. There's one that is back there waiting for you that is sliced up, and then there's this one which we'll also take back. And I just wanted to say the blessing together here, so when you go down to the parish hall for a reception, you don't have to wait for that, but can just simply go and start. So let me offer the blessing, and then we'll do two last readings to finish. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And you can say Amen. And we say a blessing for something that's important to do that act immediately after the blessing, which is why I took the bite. I listed some resources for you to look at when you go home to learn more about the Holocaust. Please feel free to contact me about it. Even though I'm moving, I'll have the same email. Here is an inscription that was found in a cellar written by Jews who were hiding from the Nazis. I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love, even when not feeling it. I believe in God, even when He is silent. So in the bold words in the bottom, please finish reading with me. When you stand here, be silent. When you leave here, be not silent. Thank you all for joining today.